We welcome you here to Duke Law School. I see some Duke Law students, but also some members of the community and other parts of campus, so I'm really pleased to have you here. This is our one renovated large classroom, and we're hoping to do the other two this summer. I think this day in particular is a really good day for folks like ourselves across the country and law schools and universities and in our communities to challenge each other about how we think about each other, particularly about race. Toward this end, about 10 years ago, I teach a course in gender and law, and I offered, after a unit on client advocacy and representing people in legal services type settings, I offered 5 points. I offered to add 5 points to anyone on their exam if they could give the name of a single member of the housekeeping staff. And it was a little surprising. No one was able to claim those 5 points, although word traveled the next year for people in that class that you ought to get to know some names if you wanted a very easy 5 points. But in that class, there ensued a very interesting discussion. I thought that this was a pretty nifty idea and that I was pretty cool to think of it. And one of the students, an African-American woman, said, isn't it just like you white people to think that all you need to do is know my name and you know something about me? And thereupon followed one of the more frank and open discussions that I've ever had in this building about race. And you just sort of never know when those might happen. You hope they happen, especially on days like today. And as I say, I think thinking about challenging ourselves is the best thing that we can do on this day. When Professor Charles Ogletree was at the law school yesterday morning, one of the things he observed in the audience was how people had seemed to sit in race clusters. And so I thought one challenge that I would issue you today is to think about that fact in at least the next week, maybe the next year, as you sit in places like this. Think about who you're sitting with and how you might, if you didn't think that was ideal, think about whether there are other strategies you could follow when you come into a room sitting with people, many of whom you do not know. So I was just sort of thinking this morning driving into work about what kind of school this would be if we regularly would expect when we walked into a room to find real integration of our audiences, of our classes, of students when they're eating lunch and so on. I know there are a lot of people in this room who know a lot more about this as scholars than I do, but certainly is kind of an interesting vision from a dean's perspective to think about a school that really operated that way. So I turn the program over to Professor Trina Jones, who is going to introduce this wonderful panel today.
Okay, we're here today to remember the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and all of the brave men and women who fought with him in the struggle for civil rights. In the days leading up to this holiday, we've all heard snippets from Dr. King's speeches and hopefully read a few ourselves. Undoubtedly, Dr. King was a gifted orator, but we lose sight of the richness of his example and the continuing relevance of his life and work to today's complex social issues if we fail to remember and fail to teach future generations that Dr. King was more than his words. He was an activist and organizer, a strategic planner and implementer, a man, not a romanticized myth, a man, moreover, who worked tirelessly and risked everything for concrete goals. Goals like economic empowerment, community investment, affordable housing and home ownership, decent health care and educational opportunity, and freedom from police brutality for all. On this day, we must remember, as Dr. Dorothy Height reminds us, that Dr. King was not assassinated for dreaming. He was assassinated because he dared to challenge the system. It is all too easy to focus on one aspect of Dr. King's legacy, to bask in gifted oratory and heartwarming images that make us feel good, and to forget that what Dr. King did and what he called us to do is to roll up our sleeves, crawl into the trenches, and commit to doing the hard work of eliminating inequality and injustice. The three men who have joined us have heeded this call and have committed their life's work to the cause of racial injustice. That is why I am extremely honored to introduce them today. Dr. John Hope Franklin was born in Rentisville, Oklahoma in 1915, only 50 years after the formal end of slavery. His father was a lawyer, and his mother was an elementary school teacher. I've read that from an early age, Dr. Franklin learned the power of words and ideas. Following his father's example, he spent every evening reading or writing, a practice that continues to this day. That activity has made Dr. Franklin one of the most prolific and highly esteemed historians on the planet. He's written a number of acclaimed books, including The Emancipation Proclamation, The Militant South, The Free Negro in North Carolina, Reconstruction After the Civil War, A Southern Odyssey, Travelers in the Antebellum North, and Runaway Slaves, Rebels on the Plantation. Perhaps his best-known work is From Slavery to Freedom, A History of African Americans. Now in its 8th edition, From Slavery to Freedom is considered to be the definitive work on the subject and has been translated into Indian, Japanese, German, French, Portuguese, and Chinese. Dr. Franklin has led and been active in numerous professional and educational organizations and has served on a number of presidential commissions and delegations. He's received more honors than I can recount today. Suffice it to say, he has received honorary degrees from more than 100 colleges and universities. In his honor, Duke University opened the John Hope Franklin Center for Interdisciplinary and International Studies in 2000. I also understand that Dr. Franklin is an avid cook and grower of orchids, and I'm still waiting for my invitation to dinner. He said, come to the greenhouse first. I'll take you up on that. Dr. William Darity, Sandy to his friends, is the Carrie C. Balshamer Professor of Economics at UNC Chapel Hill, where he is also the director of the Institute of African American Research and an adjunct professor in sociology. As if that were not enough, he holds an appointment as research professor of public policy, African and African American studies, and economics here at Duke. Dr. Darity's research focuses on inequality by race, class, and ethnicity, North-South theories of development and trade, the history of economic thought and political economy, the Atlantic slave trade and the Industrial Revolution, and the social psychology effects of unemployment exposure. Like Dr. Franklin, Dr. Darity has also been a very productive scholar. He is the co-author of Persistent Disparity, Race and Economic Inequality in the United States since 1945, and The Black Underclass, Critical Essays on Race and Unwantedness. He co-authored Macroeconomics and The Loan Pushers, The Role of Commercial Banks in the International Debt Crisis. He's the editor of Economics and Discrimination. James A. Joseph is professor of the practice of public policy studies and executive director of the United States Southern Africa Center for Leadership and Public Values here at Duke. He was born in, I hope I get this right, Opelousas, Louisiana, and is a graduate of Southern University and Yale Divinity School. Ambassador Joseph began his career as an officer in the U.S. Army and later taught at Stillman College in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where he was a leader of the local civil rights movement. Nominated by President Clinton and confirmed by the United States Senate in 1995, he was the first and only American ambassador to present his credentials to President Nelson Mandela. In 1999, President Mbeki awarded him the Order of Good Hope, the highest honor the Republic of South Africa bestows on a citizen of another country. Ambassador Joseph has had a distinguished career in government, business, education, and philanthropy. A frequent speaker to academic, civic, and religious audiences, he is the author of 2 books, The Charitable Impulse and Remaking America. A 3rd book on the changing role of ethics in public life is near completion. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to this very distinguished panel.
think I'm supposed to initiate this conversation. I'd like to welcome you all here. My personal commitment to an appropriate mechanism for social change to close the gap, the racial gap that exists in this society, is a commitment to the development of an adequate plan for reparations for African Americans. I was hoping that we could engage in a conversation today about the relationship between the attempt to adopt a reparations plan, which may seem quite chimerical to most people, to the history of the evolution of the civil rights movement. Both of our distinguished panelists today are people who have had a direct involvement in the struggle for civil rights, as well as a scholarly and intellectual view of the trajectory of the civil rights movement. So I wanted to ask each of them to offer their remarks today about the relationship between reparations and the civil rights movement, and to reflect on whether or not an embrace of reparations as an answer requires us to expand our concept of what is the goal of the movement beyond a discourse of civil rights toward a discourse of human rights. There'll probably be some other questions that will crop up in the process of thinking about this issue today, both that I might personally have, but that you as an audience will have as well. But I think that would be the initial jumping off point. So I'd like to ask Dr. Franklin, please, to speak first.
Well, I think that I don't have any problem seeing the connection between the advancement of civil rights and reparations, however one might define reparations. I think in defining it, I'm talking not so much about a specific quantifiable amount that one has in mind when he speaks of reparations. I think more in terms of this reparations as a token of justice, as a representative of right, of what is right. Whenever I go to Washington, D.C., I see all kinds of historical plaques and memorabilia and expressions of one kind or another, recognizing the historical development of this country. I see nothing yet that suggests how this country got its footing, how it developed, who did the work, what the costs were in terms of human lives. There is downtown in Washington not one indication that 7th and F Street or move up to Pennsylvania Avenue near 14th Street, we find the biggest, most flourishing slave markets that one can imagine. They flourished for years and years and years. No indication that that happened. This doesn't even begin to indicate the involvement of slaves in the construction of the public buildings. And one has to go to the record itself to find that after blacks had a major role in building the Capitol of the United States, the White House, and various other public buildings, that there's not the slightest suggestion or indication or expression of gratitude or recognition of the fact that they were important participants. And so when we speak of reparations, we speak first of the recognition of the fact that this country has up to now lived a lie with respect to the role of participants of this country in the building of it. Just lived a lie. there's by silence a denial that anyone except people from Western Europe had any kind of role in the building of this country. And what I say about the capital can be said of any other part of the country. So in the face of that, how can we not first recognize, if we are historians, if we play the historical game at all, how can we not recognize the involvement and participation of large numbers of non-white people in the building of this country, not merely in the construction of the buildings, but in the building of the economy is another thing. I got a letter just this week from a committee at Brown University that has launched a study of the role of Brown's benefactors, Brown's founders in the slave trade. And by that simple indication of inquiry, there is suggestion that perhaps there is something there, and that that university is wanting to know what the role of its founders were in providing the benefactions which were the basis of that institution's development. So that when I got personally involved in the struggle to secure reparations for the people who were victimized in the riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when I was a child, it was at long last an opportunity for me personally to express my own desire, to put it mildly, for our community in Tulsa to come clean and first to recognize and to become honest with respect to the role that they played in destroying the house that my father had secured for me to live in, and in a larger way, the role that they played in the destruction of the entire black community in Tulsa. So we come from Jamestown in 1619 to Tulsa in 1921, to Rosewood in 1923, and on. And we see I would think, un-American activities on the part of the dominant group in this country to ride the backs of the weak and unable to the glory and the glorification of this country. We have a lot to cause us to re-examine what we've done in the last 300 years. And we have a lot to have some kind of remorse about, some kind of change, of attitudes, some kind of recognition of the great wrong that's been done for 3+ centuries, right down the bed. And when you talk about affirmative action, it's a feeble kind of reparation, very feeble. We're outraged that anyone could suggest that affirmative action is at all legal or fair, just, and all kinds of preferential treatments need to be reexamined in light of the attitudes toward affirmative action. So that we might talk about legacies, and we might talk about athletic preferences and all the rest. We may lay everything on the table and ask which of these is better than the other, if any of them are worthy of our consideration. Mr. Chairman, I think that better stop there.
Thank you. Ambassador Joseph.
Thank you very much, Sandy. I want to say a brief word about reparations, and then a brief word about the question of where do we go from here. I have no quarrel with those who see reparations as a necessary prerequisite for reconciliation. But I worry about whether or not the word reparations has become so emotional that it is now a deterrent to an effective discussion of reconstruction strategies, development, and restorative justice. I also worry about the increasing tendency of the present generation of Americans to deny any obligation for a past they did not shape and practices they did not experience. And so we need to make the point as often and as strongly as we can that the legacy to which we refer is not simply slavery, but the intentional underdevelopment of a people that was involved in legal segregation. There is no doubt that the benefits many whites enjoy and the burdens many blacks face are the direct result of practices that were a fundamental part of a very recent economic and political order. I remember very strongly the barriers that were placed in my way growing up black in Louisiana's Cajun country. I remember the barriers that existed when I left New England to go to Alabama to organize the civil rights movement in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, 40 years ago. And I know the barriers that black people encounter every day because of the color of their skin. Let me say there's much I think that we can learn, however, from the South Africans in this regard. While we tend to hear primarily about the process of reconciliation in which they are engaged, here's what Archbishop Desmond Tutu had to say in his last book, and I quote, "The whole process of reconciliation has been placed in very considerable jeopardy by the enormous disparities between the rich and the poor. The huge gap between the haves and the have-nots, which was largely created and maintained by racism and apartheid, poses the greatest threat to reconciliation and stability." And then he goes on to say, "Unless houses replace the shacks in which most people live, most blacks live, unless blacks gain access to clean water, electricity, affordable health care, decent education, good jobs, and a safe environment, things which a majority of the whites have, we can just as well kiss reconciliation goodbye." Now, these are not the words we tend to hear about what is going on in South Africa. What we hear about is forgiveness on the part of those who have been the victims, and very little about reparations from those who've had benefit and what form of restitution is morally defensible and politically feasible. Now, when the South Africans were debating the new democracy and what conditions should apply and what should be first on the long agenda of change, they considered a wealth tax. And there was considerable debate about whether or not they would move to a wealth tax on the basis of providing a fund for reparations. They decided instead to develop a fund for reconstruction and development. And I think we can learn a lot from that. I would like to see a fund for reconstruction and development in the United States with two basic components. One, a fund for participatory development with resources provided by government, business, and individuals to fulfill the responsibility that society shares for the continuing legacy of slavery and segregation. But I would also like to see alongside of that a self-help fund where African Americans contribute a portion of their wealth and income to promote change and foster opportunities beyond those that the public is likely to be willing to assume. I believe that the creation of a significant self-help fund to be matched in larger numbers by public and private resources might go a long way in helping to create the national will to address the resource needs of reconstruction and reconciliation. I was the founding chair of the National Black United Fund in the early 1970s, and we organized local funds in many of the cities in our country at that time. And we learned enough about what not to do to think that this could be a feasible idea whose time has finally come. As the former president of the Council on Foundations, I still spend a lot of time talking to groups in the United States and abroad about the power and potential of organized philanthropy. Now, when one considers the potential in the Black community for contributing to a fund for reconstruction and development, two recent studies underscore the timeliness of my proposal. The first found that the earned income of Black households in 2002 was $631 billion. The second found that Black spending power was between $631 billion and $688 billion. If 2% could be mobilized for reconstruction and development purposes, we would be looking at an amount equal to the assets of the Ford Foundation and larger than the GDP of majority of the countries of the world. Stokely Carmichael was often misunderstood when he argued that there was something that Blacks and whites should do together, there were some things that whites needed to do with whites, and there were some things that Blacks needed to do with Blacks. His message was much more relevant than it sometimes appeared. It would be wonderful if some of you were willing to work for public support to address the twin legacies of slavery and segregation, while others joined in working for a parallel self-help fund that could both elevate the level of the present conversation and realistically mobilize significant resources to help form the more perfect union the framers of the Constitution sought. Now, one final word about where we go from here. I like to look at what Dr. King was talking about in the last few years of his life before his untimely death. The first was the garbage workers' strike in Memphis. Dr. King became an even greater threat to the status quo when he started to emphasize the pocketbook issues of economic development and job creation. As he once defined racism as the original American sin, a disease of the heart, he was beginning to argue that poverty was the postmodern counterpart, a disease of the head. He was no longer talking about where one sat in the bus. He was talking about owning the bus. He was no longer talking about service at the lunch counter. He was talking about the opportunity to operate it. My second observation comes out of his call for a Poor People's March in Washington. He was seeking to form a coalition of the poor without regard to race or religion, color or condition. he recognized that while all sorts of secondary issues were used to keep the poor divided, the primary issues that affected them in common were left unaddressed. And a third and last area I'd like to emphasize, because here again, Dr. King was seeking to lift the veil from our eyes. And this had to do with the increasing interdependence of the world, the connection between civil rights at home and human rights abroad. He was beginning to argue that the only way to demonstrate the efficacy of our system abroad was to demonstrate that it could work equitably for all of our citizens at home. It may be that one of his most important legacies is that he introduced us to the potential of soft power in a world dominated by hard power. He understood that while hard power, military might, and economic muscle could inflict or prevent pain, it was soft power, diplomacy, acts of generosity, respect for local traditions, and the like that was most likely to develop influence that would endure. So where do we go from here? Martin Luther King was fighting to eliminate bias, bigotry, and racism, and he was seeking to do so in ways that would make reconciliation possible. He was seeking not only the right to vote, but he would now be concerned with the failure of so many to exercise that right, and the failure of others to make certain that the act of voting brought public rather than private benefits. He would be concerned about public policy issues having to do with health care, the resegregation of our public schools, and the moral authority of our nations in an interdependent world. Yes, I have no problem with reparations, but in reality, I'd like to see something much broader, a fund for reconstruction and development that involved all of us in every context in which we find ourselves. Thank you.
I'd like to make a brief set of observations, and then I would like to open the floor to questions. The first is that my conception of the specific form of reparations is fairly open-ended, and I think encompasses the kind of rich program that Jim Joseph is proposing. I think that there is a serious question about the specific form that a reparations program might take, because it is possible to design a program where the benefits would actually redound to the individuals or the group that is responsible for making the transfer of resources to the group that is historically recognized as the victim group that should be the recipient of reparations. So the way in which a reparations program is designed is essential. In my view, reparations is supposed to achieve three aims. The first is acknowledgement of the harm. That is the recognition question that Dr. Franklin raised. Second is the provision of redress for historically generated disparities. And the third is to bring closure to the addressing of the harm. With that in mind, I would suggest that the U.S. has not begun even the process of acknowledgement. Never mind addressing the question of compensating for the historical disparities or bringing closure to the issue. The second thing that I want to mention here is that the notion of 40 acres and a mule is the folkloric statement of reparations that has been long-standing in the African American community. And one thing we should begin to recognize is that what might have been referred to as Negro folklore always proves to be true. I mean, for many, many years, folks had been talking about Strom Thurmond's black daughter. And finally, we get an acknowledgement that that was, in fact, the case. But, you know, in the black community, that was long understood to be the case. And so 40 Acres and a Mule appears to have this kind of mythic quality, but it has a factual foundation. There was a promise foregone that was made in the aftermath of the Civil War. Actually, it originally was made while the Civil War was still being prosecuted. When Sherman completed his march to the sea, he issued Special Field Order number 15, which provided for the allocation of coastal lands along the South Carolina and Georgia coast to former slaves and to refugees of the war. That land was actually settled for a brief period of time, for approximately, I would say, 3 to 4 months, before Andrew Johnson abrogated the promise and ordered the removal of the newly settled blacks from those lands. Indeed, at that point, not only were there settlements of blacks on lands that had been confiscated by the U.S. government in Georgia and South Carolina, but also in Florida. This allocation to ex-slaves was supposed to be reinforced by the terms of the Freedmen's Bureau, but again, it was abrogated because of Andrew Johnson's decisions. So there was a promise, there was an act of settlement, and it was overturned. This means that the historic land redistribution, which would have laid the foundation for eliminating the substantial disparities in wealth that we now observe between African Americans and the rest of the American population, would have been handled at the outset, but it wasn't. And so this leads me into thinking about ways in which to measure the compensation that is due. Let's say, based upon the 40 acres and a mule premise, which was 40 acres per family, and let's say it was a family of 4, essentially we're talking about 10 acres per person. If we were to value $100 per 10 acres of land in 1865 at present value, adjusting for inflation and say at a 5% or 4% interest rate, we would arrive at a figure of approximately $1.5 million per person. Now, one way to think about that is you just make a direct transfer of that sum of money. The politics of such a move are highly unlikely. In an interesting study that Michael Dawson at Harvard did in the year 2000, he found that only 4% of white Americans favored compensation for slavery for African Americans. Now, I think that the point that Jim Joseph is making is a central point. The issue of compensation doesn't exclusively center on slavery. In fact, one might argue that it's easier to make the case that compensation should be forthcoming for approximately a century of Jim Crow practices. Indeed, if you are concerned about the issue of whether or not there are living victims with respect to Jim Crow practices, there still are. But of course, if we wait long enough, there won't be. If we're concerned about any dimension of the kind of case that was made to justify the provision of reparations for Japanese Americans who were subjected to internment during World War II, every aspect of that case is fulfilled if we look at Jim Crow practices. But the final observation I want to make is that, in fact, slavery wasn't that long ago. If you think about the number of generations that have lived since slavery, it's approximately 5. And if we talk about 5 generations, I don't see that as such a distant event in terms of its impact and consequences for the living African American population and the living non-African American population in this country. Okay, so those are the comments I'd like to make, and I'd like to please open the floor to questions.
May I just
sure.
observe that I can't tell you how impressed I am with an ambassador's approach to the problems. It's very, very even-handed, and I want to commend him for that for the reason that I am not that even-handed myself. I was searching as you, Jim, as you spoke about reparations being a loaded word. I'm wondering what would not be loaded. If we're talking about, if we're going to face the problem of injustice, what is it we can do to to bridge the gap or to be a bit more soft or charitable or understanding or more
Persuasive?
no, not more persuasive, but more understanding of exactly what we want. If we can't use reparations, I know that some people think that when blacks say they want reparations, they want a Cadillac.
Right.
But that's
Lexus.
I'm not interested in that. But I am interested in programs that would make it possible for our young people, let's say, to bridge the gap, to come up, to be brought up to speed, so to speak. And I'm not rejecting, I'm not even arguing against the responsibility that you and I have and all the others have who've had some opportunity to help build these bridges. But what can we do, what language can we use to say to the larger public that they have a responsibility too, that this is something that is not merely a responsibility for the victims. It's some responsibility for the perpetrators. And how can we say that and be soft enough and in language that will not be loaded, but which will make the point that that there is a genuine public responsibility.
Well, let me say that personally, I like the word reparations. It calls up all the passion in me, all the years that I have spent fighting against the system's way of keeping people poor and of discriminating against blacks. However, but the realism in me that mixes with the passion says that we need to have an effective conversation if we're going to create the national will. And so I have to start by admitting I like the word reparations personally, but politically and feasibly, the response to the word has become damaging to the cause. Now, what words would do that? I'm not sure, but I like the notion of a fund for reconstruction and even reconciliation, which says that there cannot be any reconciliation until there's been a redress of the legacy of the past. I think that we can find ways to do that. But I start off by saying that I too would like to be able to use that word, but I just don't think it's going to do it in terms of the public support we will need if we are to effectively mobilize the resources we seek.
Jim, it sounds like you're raising a public relations kind of question.
Yeah.
And I'm not entirely convinced that that's going to make a difference. I mean, I think that ultimately the general public's going to have to be convinced of the substance of what is required of a reparations program. The reason I say that is because I go back to Michael Dawson's study, where the question that's asked of respondents is, are you in favor of monetary compensation for African Americans for slavery? So he doesn't even invoke the term reparations. He uses the phrase monetary compensation, and only 4% of the respondents say yes, that they're in favor of that. So I think to have there's a key question as to how we open up the conversation widely enough so that people will listen with open ears. But I think people are going to have to consent to the substance of what you're describing, and I'm not certain that the label is ultimately going to make much difference. So,
I don't know what. I'm glad you mentioned that because I've been shopping around myself to try to find out what language can be used that would not be, shall we say, offensive. That would not be that would not raise the hackles. I thought that at one time that affirmative action, yes, that's it. Yet people say that that's the worst thing that you could even suggest. And the President of the United States used Martin Luther King's birthday last year to order his Justice Department to register opposition to affirmative action. Now, if it's at that high level, well, let's throw out affirmative action as a possible
Right.
expression of need or reparations or compensation or whatever. I'm really searching for.
Well, I don't want that suggestion, which is just one of many I made, to be a deterrent to an effective discussion of strategies, because that's really what we are talking about. But I just throw that out on the basis of my experience in South Africa. You know, when I started out organizing the civil rights movement in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, my whole style and vocabulary and language would have been very different. But based on the experience I have now had in trying to promote change over all those years, I have to, lay that caution on the table.
Question?
Comment. My name is Amos Mills, Student Law Class 72. I think the problem in America is that America has not acknowledged race as an issue. And that's why, if we look at history, we look at what happened after the Civil War, the first Reconstruction, white people did not want to hear about blacks anymore. The troops were withdrawn from the South, and then you had the Jim Crow coming in. And the same thing has happened again. We have to change people's hearts. I don't care what type of term you use, if it's reparations or whatever, if people don't see, I think Professor Ogilvie mentioned yesterday, we have to make the majority community see that this civil rights, this thing benefits them. That it's cheaper to educate all of that population than to spend a lot of a portion of your resources using corrective measures like building more prisons and other things of that. I think that's the problem. We have not even acknowledged. If you ask people about slavery, a lot of people in the majority of the population will tell you that the slaves were happy. Everything was lovey-dovey. That's not true. So what we have to do is educate people, get on their hearts. That's how our King civil rights movement changed our whole nation. However you do it, the moral conscience of this community has to be changed to let them know that our failings, our faults, our problems are their problems. If not, with this old saying that goes, if we don't learn how to live together, we're all going to die. And there's only so many resources that we have. And surely you would think that if we could find $56 billion to rebuild Iraq, surely we have to find some of that money to help rebuild America. Thank you.
I just to comment, I completely agree with you. And Dr. King started out emphasizing mobilization of moral power. And we have tried that, and I personally am committed to what you're saying. But I think some way we have to also demonstrate that it's in the national self-interest, because people understand the language of self-interest, even though they may not act on the basis of what appears to be a moral imperative.
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Hazel Stern, and I'm American, but I'm also from the Caribbean and became American. And what I noticed is in the school system, it has to be like a re-education here, because the youngsters doesn't even have appreciation for where they came from or knowing about Martin Luther King on the whole. So I think that's where we have to start, educating, putting funds into education, especially with young black boys, and of course girls, but starting from 3 years old, really re-educating them with this whole system of education.
Yes.
I think you made a dramatic case for the justness of the cause. I think you also made the assumption that if you advocate on the basis of truth and honesty, people will come to certain conclusions. Now, when I ask what if they don't come to certain conclusions, which I suspect will be the case. And I think that somewhere along the line, you have to address the issue of the lack of willingness of this country to be honest, really. I think you have to address that, and I think the manner in which we choose to bring the issue forward and create an environment in which the solution can be discussed is very important.
I think that there is an impulse in this country that resonates very differently when claims are made on this country by African Americans than when claims are made by other groups. I definitely do not want to begrudge the success that the Japanese American community had in achieving what was called, I guess, the American Civil Liberties Act of 1988, because there's no question in my mind that the internment was a grievous injustice directed against them. But you'll find, for example, that Representative Henry Hyde has contended that there's no basis for reparations for African Americans for slavery. He says that it implies that those whites living today would bear the burden of payment, and they were not responsible for crimes committed by people who have long since passed away, so that accountability is not to be validated for existing white Americans. On the other hand, he was an enthusiastic supporter of the American Civil Liberties Act of 1988. So you're really raising a question that goes to the core of how our society thinks about race and about difference. And there is something that's, there's a way in which African Americans are cordoned off in terms of acceptability of our claims. And I'm not certain how that has changed, but it is something that would have to be achieved through struggle. I mean, I frequently said that if it was 1956 and I was in Johannesburg, South Africa as a black man, probably working in some menial task, I may think that there would never be an end to apartheid. And so similarly, one might think in the year 2003 that it's unlikely that a serious and an effective reparations program may never be adopted. But I think that the process of engaging in conversations, even with an audience that probably this audience is relatively sympathetic on the whole, there may be those who are not, but the sort of beginning this process of having conversations with wider and wider audiences across the country may have the effect of changing sentiment.
When I was, Chairman, I was chairman of the President's Advisory Board on Race, looking toward what he called One America. We were really very optimistic that we could, what the president called, start a conversation on race. We weren't supposed to solve anything. Start a conversation on race. Just discuss it. So he appointed us on Friday. Sunday, there was a op-ed piece in the New York Times that this was criticizing the president for having suggested that we talk about race. And it went on to say that there was no, that first place, there was no reason to talk about it. There was no problem. And that the people he appointed were just going to make it worse. 7 people going to make it worse. 7 people going to make it worse. So, you know, this caused me to really wonder whether or not we could have even discuss the matter. That's all the president asked. Talk about it. Just to engage in a conversation. And you would have thought he had called on this nation to give up what it had and turn it over to blacks. That's the way the reaction was. And we went around this country. We went in every part of the United States, holding these meetings and everything, and nowhere did we get anything suggesting or resembling an acceptance of the idea that we might talk about it. Just talk about it. And the search for a way of doing it is ongoing. And if there's if what any of us say today is a step in that direction, I welcome it. But I must tell you that after traveling over this country for many thousands of miles for 18 months, I didn't know where we should go from there.
Getting back to what Dr. Franklin said earlier about having understanding, and what James Joseph said about having regression and legacy. In order to have that, we have to be more than sympathetic. And as this gentleman said, that have problem is our problem. I think we have to be empathetic in order to help reach the solution. And as the Bible says in Galatians 6:2, value one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ.
Yeah, way in the back.
No comment.
I have a question, twofold question for any of the panelists. One, how does the fight for reparations, what are the implications of present-day images of African Americans in the media? Because as I watch TV, the images that are perpetuated in the media of African Americans are the same images that were used to justify slavery. Black males who are quote unquote media uneducated, being thrown in jail, basically who are like animals, women who are, clothed topless, dancing, in videos. These are the images that, as a 24-year-old, I see in the media. And it appears to me that if one is looking to make a fight for reparations, folks are going to have to see that the image today, in some part, justifies that. And it seems to me that image cuts away from the fight for reparations. And two, how in that fight, how are we going to get folks today to realize that it's just not a fight about acknowledging past wrongs, but taking up a cause today? I get disheartened to look at even my law school classmates, who I think are extremely intelligent, but have no desire or will to go out and make the world a better place in terms of racism. So how, one, are we going to attack the media in terms of education that has reparations? And two, how are we going to get generations now to really take this up as a cause, and not just really just to look back and say, I'm sorry for that, okay, now let's move on, but really take this up as a cause for our generation.
Well, yes, thank you. The first, the first question about images, I ended by saying that each of us in our own context has to determine how we can make an impact in the sector in which we live and work. And so the struggle is so multifaceted that we can't talk just about one particular initiative, one particular strategy. We've got to talk about many strategies. And I would hope that the black coalitions in the media would do more to address that issue. I would hope that if there was a fund for reconstruction and development, that one of the dimensions of its work would be education. When the South Africans decided they wanted to have reconciliation, they realized they were going to have to also provide the truth about the past. And so they set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission rather than simply just a Justice and Reconciliation Commission, because there were conflicting images of the past. And so they saw the need for education. And as Wordsworth once said, it is worse to be mistaught than untaught. And a lot of Americans have been mistaught about African Americans. And so we're going to have to go back and do that educational job. And so I agree with you. But how it ranks in the priorities that we establish for the agenda for reconstruction, development, and reconciliation would have to be determined. But I think it's fundamental, because I think we are in danger of this conversation become a very marginal one. And if we are really serious about this discussion taking place at the heart of our public life, then I think we need to be concerned about public relations and how African Americans are perceived and how they're portrayed, and that has to be a fundamental part of our educational work.
Wow, okay. Middle?
I have a couple of thoughts. One is I'm curious as to know strategically what might be the best mechanism or mechanisms to proceed with this idea. That's to say, we're sitting here in the law school, and one of the things that came to mind was that this is perhaps a legal issue primarily, or maybe it's a political issue. It's something that you try to deal with through Congress. But my principal concern is about strategy. And I guess the other thing I was had to do with what does the end look like? I think it was in Dr. Darity, you spoke about one of the principal functions of reparations is to provide closure. And when we, I want you to take us to this place of closure, and what does that look like?
Okay. My personal belief is that this is something that has to be resolved legislatively, which is very different from, I think, the position that, say, Charles Ogletree has taken. The reason I feel that way is because my sense is that if you were to achieve success in introducing a reparations program through the judicial route, it can be abrogated by the resistance of a population that's not committed to reparations. Vis-a-vis, take a look at the story of the long history of Brown versus Board. Okay, so my position is that we need to have a law that's passed by Congress that provides reparations. And that's why it becomes vital to create a climate in the society where there is widespread support for such an initiative. Okay, so that's the first thing. I think it's the legislative route that has to be pursued. The second question was, what does the world look like if we have an effective reparations program in place and we bring about closure? The complaint that some of the black critics of reparations have made is that if we were to get reparations, we would never be able to make further claims on American society for past injustice. And my response is yes, that's absolutely correct. That is the purpose of having an effective reparations program, is to bring closure. So closure, from my perspective, would mean that there would not be a further set of race-based claims that African Americans would bring to the U.S. government. So that's my view of what the world would look like after reparations. Yeah.
So the question of the end, and I think that's a good question, and I hate to keep emphasizing the language we use and how we articulate all this, but you know, even in the celebration of today, people will gather in solemn assemblies around the world, and they will honor the legacy of Dr. King as a moral leader who called us to a higher and more noble purpose. They will celebrate his life as the life of a reformer who challenged the prevailing political and economic orthodoxy. Every time I make a speech about Dr. King, I talk about him as a patriot who sought to complete the American Revolution. What he was trying to do was to form the more perfect union. And if you remember, in the preamble to the Constitution, the framers said that in order to form a more perfect union, we'd have to establish justice. We'd have to promote the general welfare. And so the end is the completion of the American Revolution, the forming of a more perfect union by a group of folks who see themselves as patriots. And I think that's the way we have to sort of recast this image of why we honor Dr. King and recast this image of what it is we are trying to do. And so what we're trying to do is to make this nation work. We're trying to change the image of this nation in the world community. We're trying to help to promote democracy abroad by demonstrating that we can make it work here. I mean, that's what we're trying to do. That's the end we seek.
I would like to I merely call your attention to the fact that this tack was taken by Justice Marshall in his address before the American Bar Association in 1976 when he pointed out some of the flaws in the Constitution, some of the need to revise the Constitution. He called it a flawed document, you remember, Kate. And there were people who wanted to run it out of it, not merely out of Hawaii, but out of the country entirely for that. So that there might be a softer and more diplomatic way of saying it, but I think it's very important for us to remember that some of this has been tried before without very much success, and it may need the soft touch of a James Joseph rather than a sort of blunt statement of Thurgood Marshall, but you're saying the same thing. I guess you'd say it's the way they say it.
Yeah, well, I'm interested in the distinction you're making. I mean, most of the folks who knew me in my early years in organizing the civil rights movement would never think of me as using a soft touch. The folks who knew me when I was head of the Southern California Committee Against the Vietnam War wouldn't think of me as using a soft touch. But I realized that it was the later Mandela who was the most effective rather than the early Mandela. And so that there are times for different strategies. And I think strategies relate to context. And I think we have to be careful not to use the strategy of an earlier context in history and point in history for the present context and present point in history. And so that's all I'm trying to say. But I'm quite willing to go back to the streets if that become necessary.
The lady in the black, yeah.
I have a question for Ambassador Joseph. You were mentioning some pretty interesting statistics on black spending power, and I was wondering, with such a diverse, sometimes partitioned black community, how do you suggest unifying such a vast people towards one specific goal?
Well, I mentioned that I started out trying this as the founding chair of the National Black United Fund in the 70s, and I found out that we were too militant and self-affirming, and therefore we were never able to raise resources to make much of a difference because we couldn't even bring in the middle class. But I think now, and I participate in a lot of initiatives by the Kellogg Foundation, by the Ford Foundation, and others to develop self-help giving in communities of color. And I look at the potential out there, and given my own experience, having worked in this area for a large part of my life, I think it's one of the ways in which I can make a contribution by helping to develop that sort of resource for those purposes. Now, you can argue about all of the questions about who will provide the governance for this, who will make decisions about the distribution of funds, all of the kinds of things that'll divide us. But I certainly think that there are ways of finding common ground. I recently spoke to a group of black professionals in New Haven about this idea, and as I listened to the arguments among themselves, I could have sat there and said, this is not going to work. Why are you wasting your time? But after a couple of hours of conversation, we're beginning to find common ground. And I think it's possible to get beyond the internal diversity and division to find common ground. And I have to remain optimistic about that possibility, or else I couldn't work for it.
Okay, in the way back there.
Thank you, Sandy.
Okay, I'll get you next.
To highlight what Ambassador Joseph said about if there were a national fund, it need to be an area that focused on education. As Dr. Franklin said a moment ago, we need more programs to help our youngsters bridge the gap and get caught up. And that's one of my focuses. And I spend a great deal of time in the public schools. And there are a lot of young people in the public schools that feel there's no hope, that feel enslaved because of a lack of an opportunity. So I just think everyone in here needs to realize we all have sons, daughters, nieces, nephews, grandkids. We need to spend more time in the public schools, and there really is a dire need for more programs aimed at encouraging and helping children to grow their minds. Many kids feel they have no hope at all. None.
Yeah, nice.
Hi, I'm Sweetie. It's just such an honor to hear you speak. But my question is, where would reparations fit in terms of experiencing a cultural renaissance within the Black community? I know that you guys touched on it being more than an economic or legal issue. It goes beyond that because you have to look back at the historical circumstances.
She asked, how would reparations fit into cultural renaissance in the black community? How could it?
Well, I think that it's central to any pursuit of the question of equity or justice in the black community. I think that it fits in well. You can call it what you want to. If you don't like the term reparations, call it something else. But surely there is a place for this kind of exercise, or whatever you want to call it, to improve conditions in the black community. As the ambassador said, you could call it justice, or you could call it, give it some other name, but by any other name, it's very important, it seems to me, to have this concept to continue, modified or whatever.
I think the attention to the concept of reparations already is having an impact, particularly in terms of artistic products in the black community. Whether that means the lyrics that some of the hip-hop artists produce, but also, I mean, there's a local visual artist, Malcolm Goff, who's one of the central themes of much of his work is the historical injustices that are linked to the case for reparations. And so, if the movement were to become more expansive, I think it would have a broad impact on a wide range of dimensions of the cultural practices in the black community, and also cultural practices by artists who are not necessarily members of the black American community, but are in other groups in the society.
I would also add that I think it plays a very important psychological dimension. If you are going to mobilize people to act, you have to have something to motivate them. And so I think part of that also has to do with historical memory. I think we need to remind people of the richness of the African past, as well as the richness of the cultural contributions, in order to create the kind of community, the sense of cohesiveness we will need in the community if we will get people passionately committed to what we are advocating. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, Fortinbras said to Horatio, "I have some rights of memory in this kingdom." We need to be talking about the rights of memory of black people in this kingdom and affirming our contribution to this society. And I think if we can do that, we help to create the psychology that's necessary to mobilize people for action.
It's amazing how quickly an hour can go. We're going to take a couple more questions and then bring this to a close. Ben Reese?
As the concept of diversity continues to get inculcated in our society and our discourse, does that concept and the practice detract from a continued focus on race and on African Americans? I know lots of people would say it's not a choice of either or, but the reality is in practice, you often have to make a choice. So does the concept undermine a continued focus on race?
Oh, I don't think it does. I think it's a necessary part of where we are. Now, when I think about the days in which, this year we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Brown decision, and I was in public schools in Louisiana at that time the decision was made. But the emphasis at that time and the image of diversity at that time was one of access and to some degree assimilation. The classes were to be more diverse, but the cultural ethos basically remained the same. The present emphasis is on diversity is an unassimilated diversity rather than an assimilated diversity. And so people in institutions that are diverse need to learn how to manage that diversity, or else we will have the resegregation that everybody's concerned about. So I don't think you can talk about any of this without talking about how to deal with diversity and how diversity has changed. We initially wanted access and presence, and so we got in the door. We now want to sit at the table. We initially got the pass on the bus. We now want to upgrade the pass. And so we need to be talking about how we do all those things in diverse communities rather than just having diverse communities. And the problem of it is diversity has become an end rather than a process. And we don't know how to deal with diversity as a process. Thank you.
That question was raised by the Vice President for Institutional Equity.
And I thought I gave his answer.
Okay, the woman over here in red.
What I was gonna bring up is, I was kinda like the gentleman back there a while ago with the school system, and he was also bringing up part of the school system a while ago with the diverse part. Well, I know by seeing it firsthand, by being in it also, we are at the stage now where I think if, the president's cabinet on the Department of Education would take over and redo the book part of it to bring the younger kids, cause the school systems themselves, I know from the year 2000, we were trying to do things that would amplify the year 2000. And so I helped to write a play about the African Americans from back then to the present, that of the year 2000, of all the inventions and things like that. And I've learned all the diverse of it. I've learned all the rights and wrongs of what some of the white people have actually thought that they invented was actually invented by African Americans, and it was taught wrong, and it should be taught right from the younger person clean up to the older people. So our books need to be rewritten, and even the other studies like are coming out into colleges. I mean, we should keep up with them from like when we're in the smaller grades, clean on up through the colleges with that to keep us current. You know, when something new comes up, new laws or, you know, different things like that, I think it would be so much handier. Because the cultures are all changing. I mean, everybody's being thrown together. I mean, people from other countries are coming here. I mean, everybody's got to tell everybody, you know. We just can't tell them in just a book when the book's like 50 years old, and we need to keep it current and keep on keeping it current with stuff. And I think if he would do it in the cabinet like that, put like a committee of the Department of Education or something to study it and everything like they do other things, you know, down there with like the states and everything, with the government. I think with governor and stuff, I think it could be implemented.
Any comments in response?
Well, you know, I appreciate what you said about what we could hope from the Department of Education. I think clearly one of the things we haven't talked about, and it's the need to engage in the making of public policy, because the parameters of our flexibility are often limited by public policy. And so I'd like to see more people getting involved in trying to change public policy. And slogans are not going to do it. You know, I served on the board of the Children's Defense Fund for a number of years, and even as chair. And from the very beginning, we had a slogan that said, "Leave no child behind." Our slogan has been stolen, but not our goals.
Okay, one final question.
I merely wanted to say that your point is well taken. We don't do nearly enough in the way of keeping our teaching materials up to date. As a historian, I'm very, very aware of that, and I would merely add that this cannot be done by committee. It cannot even be done by a department. It has to be done by people who are committed to looking beyond where we are in terms of materials, teaching materials, and who have the skills, the information and the skills to do the job better. But there certainly needs to be that better. We can't really do very much unless we are certain of what we have already done, of what has already happened. Our memory, we can't trust that unless it's based on something very substantial and real and is sound. We've got a lot of memory, we just don't know it. And that's because we don't produce the kind of materials that will preserve that memory. But you're very, very right.
One final question, the student in the burgundy shirt.
I guess to go along with what you were just saying, Ambassador Joseph, as I'm sure you're aware, 4 days ago, the President of the United States laid a wreath on Martin Luther King's grave. The next day, he appointed a segregationist to the federal bench. And my question is, how do we mobilize people in America who are legitimately outraged by a government that is not working towards justice in order to become involved in the political process and ensure that we will have a new government that does work for justice?
I think you ought to add that he was on his way, when he laid the brief, he was on his way to $1.5 million fundraiser too. That's what he was in Atlanta for.
Well, as we come to a conclusion, it's not the best time to begin to raise the political questions. Since we obviously are not going to have enough time, but it seems to me that you've raised a key question, and I would throw it back to you and say, how do you mobilize students and young people your age so that they participate in the political process? And that's what I would like to do, I'd like to see you do, is to work where you are and try and mobilize people to address these issues. It is unfortunate that many of us who stand for the poor find that the poor don't tend to have enough confidence in voting to get out and vote. And so there is a tendency to become frustrated and say the very people for whom we are working are not participating. But I think that one of the things we're going to have to do is to rekindle a sense of hope. And if people are hopeless and sense that there's nothing they can do, then they won't do anything. And so when you ask the question, how do we get people out there, we have to somehow find a way to kindle this sense of hope. Not a naive optimism, but the kind of hope that'll lead to action. And I think you can do it by starting where you are. And that is, as a student, as a young person, finding ways to network with other people your age and in the same contextual situation you are to get them involved in the political process. And I think all of us need to do that, but particularly those of you in universities who are likely to feel frustrated and alienated from the process, I think you need to get involved. And that's what I would say. Now, my final comment, and it goes back again to something I wanted to say when Ben raised the question about diversity. I think we need to rethink our concept of community. And we still live with outdated notions of community. And I'm often reminded of something that Martin Luther King learned from his professor at Boston University, Howard Thurman, who was fond of saying, I want to be me without making it difficult for you to be you. And I think if there's anything we can learn from the memories of Dr. King, is that's what we're about. We want to build a kind of diversity, the kind of community where I can be me without making it difficult for you to be you. Can you imagine how different our world would be if we could say that? Thank you.
My decisions are always subject to being overruled, and it has been pointed out to me by William Darity that William Darity has a question. So let me take the final question from the son of one of our panelists.
Well, you're talking about motivating young people to help in this cause, and motivating us, you have to understand who we listen to, and you need to get those people that we listen to talk about this issue. I know for a fact that everyone in my school goes home and watches MTV every day after school. So if you get some rock star or hip hop artist to make a song about this, because remember in the 60s, the Vietnam protests were aided by people writing songs about it and playing those songs with us. So now all you need is a music video about it.
Okay. When I was a child, we all had really different experiences, but when I was a young girl, young people weren't allowed in the living room when the elders spoke. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Usually they were talking about family gossip, but sometimes they would discuss moments, significant issues of the day. And when you were allowed to sit in, if you sat silently, you would always benefit. You'd learn something important. I feel like we've all been invited into the living room today. And not only have we been able to benefit from their intelligence, we've been able to ask questions, which is something that was unheard of in my youth. I hope that we can have a continuing dialogue about some of these very important issues, moving beyond reparations to perhaps discussing the connection between reparations and education more explicitly, to address some of the issues that the young William Darity raised about how do we reach out to a younger generation. So you all, I think I'm fairly confident in saying, on behalf of Duke Law School and our dean, you're all welcome to come back as often as you like to continue this sort of conversation. I also need to thank the Jean E. and Christine P. Mills Conversation Series and the Martin Luther King Commemoration Committee for assisting us in putting together this panel and sponsoring it. We're going to have a reception on the third floor loggia following this event, and I'd like to thank you all for coming and to thank Dr. Franklin, Dr. Darity, and Ambassador Joseph again.